On July 15, 1958, at 10:30 p.m., on Menlove Avenue in Liverpool, one of the events that would profoundly mark John Lennon's life occurred. Due to a macabre twist of fate, his beloved mother, Julia Elizabeth Lennon, 44, was sadly killed by a vehicle driven by an off-duty police officer, who was allegedly driving under the influence of alcohol. This fateful and sudden accident occurred just 3 days after John had recorded his first 78 RPM single with his group, the Quarrymen, at Percy Phillips' studio in Kensington, Liverpool. Various authors have mischaracterized this fateful event, and much of what was said at the time was denied years later. In this chapter, we'll tell you in detail what really happened before, during, and after the tragic death of Julia Elizabeth Lennon, one of the first people to collaborate in the musical formation of John Winston Lennon, founder of the most important group on the planet, the Beatles. Before beginning this story, let's put it into context so you understand why Julia's death significantly affected so many people in her immediate circle. In November 1945, Julia enrolled her son John in kindergarten at Mospitz Lane Primary School on Woolton Road, Wavertree, located 600 meters from her home. Although John would only attend this institution for 6 months, he would later enter Dovedale Primary School in May 1946. At the same moment after John began preschool, Julia found a part-time job at the coffee house on Church Road, a cafe near Mospitz Lane. Julia accompanied John to kindergarten in the mornings and picked him up at noon after work. In early 1946, Julia met 28-year-old Bobby Dykins, and they began a torrid affair. Dykins worked as a wine taster at the prestigious Adelphi Hotel on Ranelagh Street. Julia was 24 at the time and had already separated from John's father, Alfred Lennon, but was still married to him. In fact, they never divorced. The irreverent Julia Lennon had to confront the conservative, religious, and patriarchal prejudices of the time, which considered her to be living in sin, and John himself, barely 5 years old, had to endure the sarcastic and poisonous comments at school from those who insulted his mother and called her immodest, lustful, and immoral. Julia and Bobby then begin cohabiting under the not-so-glamorous condition of cohabitation, but this further exacerbates criticism from people, especially from their own family. Julia's father, the temperamental Pop Stanley, explodes with fury upon seeing his favorite daughter living with one man and married to another. Mimi Smith, as the older sister, takes charge of the situation and directs her attack at the couple. The next day, very early in the morning, she takes the bus and heads to the Love Nest to try to reason with her sister. A heated exchange of insults immediately ensues. But Julia, being very stubborn, an innate characteristic of the Stanley sisters, ignores her older sister's high-sounding threats and, in a venomous tone, demands that she leave their humble home. But Mimi isn't going to give up so easily, and on a second visit, she realizes that little John doesn't have a room, not even a bed of his own, and is sleeping with Julia and Bobby. Mimi denounces her little sister and goes to her house accompanied by officials from the Public Assistance Committee of the Liverpool Department of Social Services. Mimi demands that the committee give her custody of her nephew John, since Julia hasn't shown any signs of behaving like a truly responsible mother. Furthermore, Mimi maliciously reveals that Julia is still legally married to John's father. And if that weren't enough, to top off her offensive, she makes it public knowledge that Julia had given birth to a daughter by an unknown man and had no choice but to give her up for adoption. This latter matter was a private matter known only to a few members of the Stanley family. So, in light of these revelations, Julia, pressured by her family and the authorities, has no choice but to hand over her son, John, to her sister Mimi to be the child's legal guardian. John begins living in his Aunt Mimi's house, which they had lovingly named Mendips. Mimi lives there with her husband, George Smith. After several years, the dust settles and things return to normal. Pop Stanley sadly dies on March 2, 1949, at the age of 75. Mimi and Julia reconciled, but they would have to wait until John turned 13 and was able to travel independently to visit his biological mother with Mimi and George Smith's permission. By early 1949, Julia and Bobby had moved to the No. 1 Blomfield Road, in the suburb of Allerton, just 2.5 kilometers from Mendips. Julia and Bobby had already had their first child, Julia Dykins, born on March 5, 1947, and their second child, Jackie, was born on October 26, 1949. In 1953, when John was already a 13-year-old teenager, he began visiting his mother in Blomfield Road, seeking to re-establish his bond with her. He often slept over at the house, occupying the bed of his 6-year-old sister, Julia, who in turn slept with 4-year-old Jackie. Later, John would spend entire weekends with the Dykins family, and eventually he would stay for weeks at a time. In fact, John began to be considered part of the Dykins family. The restoration of the filial bond between Julia and John was anchored by their love and passion for music. By then, John had a harmonica that Uncle George had given him, and he practiced constantly on it. Sadly, on June 5, 1955, George Smith died suddenly from a liver hemorrhage. To escape the sadness that gripped Mendips, John intensified his visits to his mother's house. Julia, who was 41 at the time, also shared a fondness for rock and roll, a completely unusual characteristic among most women of that time, who saw rock and roll as an extravagant and grotesque fashion that contravened moral values. And it was thought that this vulgar music would inexorably lead all young people to imminent perdition. That year, 1955, Julia began teaching John to play the banjo, and it was then that the budding musician discovered he could sing and play at the same time, something he found impossible to do when practicing with the harmonica. Julia taught John to play at least 4 songs she considered her favorites. These tunes were Ramona, Girl of My Dreams, Little White Lies, and Don't Blame Me. John's friend, Colin Hanton, also witnessed Julia teaching her son the chords to Maggie May, which would later be included in the Quarrymen's repertoire and recorded by the Beatles on their 1970 album, Let It Be. In January 1956, the skiffle craze broke out in Britain, and in the middle of that year, John formed his own skiffle band with his gang and schoolmates, naming it the Quarrymen, inspired by his school's anthem, the Quarry Bank. Julia, using her basic banjo skills, began teaching John and fellow band member Eric Griffiths how to play the guitar. Julia also taught John how to play the ukulele and accordion. Lennon learned how to play his favorite songs at Julia's house, who enjoyed rock and roll like any teenager of the time, including Elvis Presley, Gene Vincent, Little Richard, and Buddy Holly, among others, although her favorite was always the handsome Elvis Presley. This wonderful woman actively supported her son in the formation of his musical group, and Blomfield Road became one of their regular rehearsal spots. As in other places where they rehearsed, Lennon and McCartney would later state that they enjoyed playing in the small bathroom of Julia's house, because the acoustics produced in that particular space served as a home recording studio. Julia's home was also very attractive to John because of Bobby's record player in the living room. as Mimi would not accept having one of those noisy and diabolical devices in her home. A record player back then was one of the most fascinating marvels of technology. In April 1957, Julia bought John his first guitar, a South African-made Gallotone Champion, mail-ordered from London, which cost £10 at the time. Julia also advised the young group on their stage attire and attended all their performances, including the Quarrymen's performance at St. Peter's Parish Church in Woolton on July 6, 1957, a date famous in music history because that's the day John met Paul McCartney. Julia was seen whistling and dancing throughout the band's performance, but nothing could have predicted that a year after that iconic performance, Julia would have an ill-fated date with destiny and miss out on witnessing and enjoying the tremendous success her son would achieve with his modest, fledgling musical group, which would go on to become the greatest of all time. Unfortunately, Julia would never meet the Beatle John Lennon, and she would certainly have been very proud to see her beloved son become one of the most distinguished and revered musicians and composers in pop music today. July 15, 1958, had been a normal day at Blomfield Road, where Julia had lived with her partner, Bobby Dykins, since 1949, and their daughters, Julia, 10, and Jackie, 8. Bobby's mother, affectionately known as Nana, also lived at the residence. That day, John had arrived very early and planned to stay the entire weekend. John was 17 at the time. In fact, he was 3 months shy of turning 18. After dinner, John and Bobby washed the dishes and cutlery, and also cleared the table. Little Jackie went to her room, and her sister Julia went outside for a bike ride. The living room clock proclaimed it was 7 p.m., and Julia Lennon got ready to visit her sister Mimi, as she normally did once or twice a week. Julia kissed Bobby and John goodbye. Nana started to walk her daughter-in-law to the bus stop, and the two women left the house, chatting peacefully. Julia turned around and blew a tender kiss to her daughter, Julia, who was happily riding along on her bike, little suspecting that this would be the last time she would see her mother. That image of Julia blowing her a kiss would be etched in her mind for the rest of her life. Meanwhile, at Mendips, Mimi Smith is in the living room chatting with one of her tenants, Michael Fishwick. Mimi had been renting out the upstairs rooms to university students for 11 years to earn extra income. When Julia arrives at Mendips, Michael Fishwick retires to his room so the two sisters can chat comfortably, as they usually do. Mimi and Julia are insatiable talkers, another characteristic of the Stanley sisters. They also have a multitude of topics to discuss, especially everything related to John, such as his studies, personal relationships, and his stay at Mendips. After a fruitful and enjoyable 2-hour conversation, it's time to leave. It's 9:45 p.m. Mimi usually accompanies her sister to the bus stop, but at this moment she's in her bathrobe and slippers, and the number 4 bus arrives punctually at 10 p.m. There's no time for Mimi to get ready. Julia leaves through the back door of the kitchen, as is the custom at Mendips. As they walk out the front of the house, Julia and Mimi meet 17-year-old Nigel Wally, one of John's best friends and the then grandiose manager of the Quarrymen. Nigel was there because he needed to talk to John about something band-related, but Julia informed him that John was on Blomfield Road because he was spending the weekend there. Nigel tells Julia that he'll be visiting him the next day, and Julia tells him that he'll have the privilege of walking her to the bus stop that evening. Nigel replies with a broad smile on his youthful face, "It will be a pleasure, Mrs. Lennon." Julia bids her sister Mimi farewell with a hearty hug and they kiss each other on the cheek. Julia and Nigel chat and laugh all the way down Menlove Avenue to the corner of Vale Road. Nigel lives at the end of that street, so he walks Julia there. They part with a light handshake, and Julia prepares to cross Menlove Avenue to the other side of the street where the bus stop is located. Unfortunately, the place where the electric tram used to run a year ago was overgrown with thick weeds, and by a twist of fate, Julia didn't see the car coming and was violently struck. Nigel had only walked 20 meters when he heard a car brake loudly and a chilling thud that chilled his guts. The young manager instinctively turned his head toward Menlove Avenue and saw the moment Julia was fatally struck by a car. According to the fantastical literature, Nigel saw Julia Lennon fly through the air and fall 100 meters away from the scene of the accident. But this assertion is wildly exaggerated because it was later proven that the car was traveling at less than 30 miles per hour, and it is physically impossible for the accident to have occurred as the young man described it, or perhaps as the fizzy imagination of some misinformed writer described it. Julia's unconscious body hadn't shed a drop of blood, but she had suffered severe internal injuries and severe bruises. A subsequent post-mortem examination revealed that she had died from massive brain injuries. Nigel declared years later that the image of Mrs. Lennon with her auburn hair blowing around her face still lingered in his mind. At the time of the incident, Mimi and Michael Fishwick were in the kitchen when they suddenly heard the screech of tires on the avenue. They quickly ran to the scene of the accident. A crowd of onlookers was already gathering around the woman who had been struck. When Mimi glances at the person lying on the road, she begins to scream hysterically upon discovering it was her beloved sister, and screams for an ambulance to take Julia to the hospital. The ambulance arrived immediately because someone had already requested one, but it was too late to save the life of the always friendly Julia Lennon. Mimi would later testify in the case investigation that her sister left Mendips accompanied by young Nigel Wally at 9:45 p.m., heading for the Menlove Avenue bus stop. Upon hearing the accident, she went to the scene, where her sister was lying on the pavement, completely unconscious. An ambulance arrived immediately, and she accompanied Julia to Sefton General Hospital, but when they arrived, her sister had shown no signs of life. It was 10:30 p.m. Julia was only 44 years old. Look closely at this photograph. Here at this corner where the trees are located, this is where Julia and Nigel said goodbye, at approximately 10 p.m. Here we can see Menlove Avenue. And these green areas are where the electric tram used to run. The Liverpool Corporation tramways operated from 1898 to 1957. After ceasing to provide tram services, the company covered most of the tracks with asphalt or, in the case of Menlove Avenue, planted grass. The hedges that protected the tram tracks were also removed. This is Menlove Avenue in 1932. Trams ran in the center of the road, with the tram tracks protected on both sides by hedges to protect pedestrians and cyclists. In 1958, when Julia Lennon's fatal accident occurred, and after the tram service had ceased, these spaces were neglected and abandoned by negligent local authorities, and the weeds naturally reached their maximum height. We dare to assume that the person driving the car would very likely have seen Mrs. Lennon if the area had been clean and clear. Look again at this photo and you'll see the bus stop where Julia Lennon was headed the night of her death. Now let's look at a satellite view of the accident site. Here we can see some leafy bushes on Menlove Avenue in the space where the tram had previously passed. This is Mendips, the home of Mimi and George Smith. This is the path taken by Julia and Nigel as they leave Mendips. The small circle marks the corner where Nigel says goodbye to Julia. Across the avenue is the bus stop where Julia was headed, but as she crosses the avenue, the large bushes obstruct her vision. Julia doesn't see the oncoming car, and the car driver doesn't see Julia when she steps out from behind the bushes. The driver probably had no chance to avoid being hit. Contrary to John's claim, and that of a dozen other authors, the police officer was not intoxicated at the time, as he was given the appropriate examination and was found to be driving under the speed limit of 30 miles per hour. Meanwhile, on Blomfield Road, Bobby Dykins, John, Nana, and Julia's daughters were unaware of what had happened to her. At 11 p.m., a police officer appeared at the door of the residence and informed John and Bobby of what had happened, who were shocked by the shocking and sudden news. Bobby and John immediately took a taxi to Sefton General Hospital, where the lifeless body of their beloved Julia lay. Nana stayed at home looking after the girls, who were sleeping peacefully. Upon arriving at the hospital morgue, John refused to see his mother. Perhaps he thought it would be very painful to see the woman he loved so much lying lifeless on a stretcher, and also, at that moment, he felt a virulent rage gnawing at his insides, while dozens of unanswered questions swarmed in his head. John would later declare that it was the worst night of his entire life. Bobby entered the morgue, saw Julia, and collapsed, crying beside her, holding her hands. He had lost the woman of his life, the mother of his two long-awaited daughters. Half an hour later, when Bobby reunited with John in the morgue hallway, the grieving widower asked a question that John would haunt him for the rest of his life. And now, who will take care of the girls? Our humble and respectful opinion is that Mr. Bobby Dykins probably asked that reckless question unconsciously, as he was immersed in a moment of emotional turmoil due to the inconsolable and terrible pain that gripped his soul. We will continue this interesting story in the next chapter, where we will tell you when and where Julia Elizabeth Lennon's funeral was held. We will also reveal all the details about the person who ran over Julia. Was he physically deprived of his freedom, or was he released? How did he discover, years later, that he had murdered the mother of the founder of the Beatles? How and when did Julia's daughters find out about their beloved mother's death? What did Bobby Dykins do after Julia's death? How did his mother's death affect John psychologically? These and other questions will be answered in our next video. Don't miss it.